Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Conference of Consulting Actuaries Leadership Development Podcast. I am your host, Michael Clark, Managing Director with Agilis out in Denver, Colorado, and a past president of the CCA as well. I'm excited to have as my guest on today's podcast, Jess Vega. Jess is an actuarial consultant at Northwestern Mutual based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. She is also a former board member of the Organization of Latino Actuaries, or OLA. We're going to talk about that a bit. But a few other interesting tidbits about Jess. She was a volunteer with a Peace Corps style organization that had her living in Cusco, Peru, which there's lots of ruins around Cusco, right?
That's the heart of the Incan Empire.
Yeah, that very cool. She was the director and president of a nonprofit yoga studio and is a graduate of Loyola Marymount University with degrees in mathematics and also theological studies, which is not a combination I think a lot of people see together very often.
That is correct. I was the only one to do
it. and still might be.
Still might be.
One thing from Jess's LinkedIn profile, I pulled this off in preparation for our discussion today, and I really like this, and I'm just going to quote it verbatim. She says, "I share my time loving my son, practicing," and I'm going to butcher this name, Linagar yoga?
Iyengar. It's
Iyengar.
Iyengar yoga.
Okay. Iyengar yoga. Playing ukulele and piano, learning from Tibetan monks, and loving the Great Lakes. That is quite the varied experience.
We all have stories under our skin, right?
And that's actually what I'm hoping to get out of you today. So there's, I read that and I was like, okay, this is someone that's got some very interesting passions and hobbies that I'm sure influence you in who you are in your day job and all of that. So anyway, Jess, welcome to the podcast. Very excited to have you as our guest today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely.
Where the heck do you want to start?
Well, let's start. I think it's helpful for people to get to know you in a professional context. Tell people what you do for work.
Yeah, so I currently work at Northwestern Mutual in our actuarial department, doing valuation, reserving, AAT reserve specifically, working specifically on annuities. Very busy with this year-end work right now.
Does that work? Is that work cyclical? Does it have a busier time than others, or?
Yeah, I'm kind of new to this role, so I haven't gone through the full cycle, but there's a lot of year-end work and March 1st deadlines, April 1st deadlines.
Okay, so the first few months of the year then are busier than normal.
Busier than normal, which is so true for many actuaries, right?
Yeah. Well, and actually, speaking of that, anybody that goes out and looks at your profile will see that you are one of several career changers that we've had on the podcast. And I think people would be interested in your career path and what led you from where you started to where you're at today.
Yeah, my story is unique. One could say it. I think especially for the profession that has so much of a path that goes from you find out what an actuary is, you go to college at a certain select number of schools, you take exams, you get hired from college, blah blah blah. Yeah, that's not my story at all. I didn't know what an actuary was until 5 years after I had graduated from college, and I had been working. Gosh, I mean, it's like, where do I even start? I I graduated back in 2010, so a couple of years after the financial crisis. Many of us, I think, coming out of college at that time, didn't exactly know what to do with ourselves. And I decided, I went to a Jesuit school and I decided to volunteer full time uh, after college, which is what led me to this Peace Corps style program that took me to Peru. But that got cut short, and I ended up doing an AmeriCorps style program that brought me to Milwaukee because I'm originally from Los Angeles.
Okay.
Born and raised in Los Angeles. Because I was like pulled into, or not pulled into, but because I decided to do this like full-time volunteer work right after college, I got pulled into very naturally into a lot of these nonprofit work. So after my year of service, I ended up, I'm using quotes because there's like whole other stories there, right? And how I like reflect on it now, years and years afterwards, and like, what does that mean? Anyways, I got pulled into like nonprofit work, and that's how I started. I got pulled into working in this nonprofit yoga studio and working in these like holistic healthcare systems and all these like different things. And what happened was that once those folks in those nonprofits knew that I could do math, they were like, oh my God, we need you to do data for us. Because part of what nonprofits have to do all the time is like justify our existence
Hmm.
and like and answer to donors and chase donations as well. So I ended up like creating these ways of trying to measure the impact of the services that these specific nonprofits were having on the people we were bringing in, because we wanted some outcomes to show folks of like what is the impact of what we're doing, right? That naturally like made me remember that I like math and I have a degree in math, and maybe I needed to like revisit what that meant for me. And then I went back to the drawing board and started just looking on LinkedIn to see like what's out there, what can I do that is tangible and has an impact on people's lives and isn't so like super theoretical as the pure mathematics that I studied, but much more practical too. And I happened to find folks I went to college with who ended up going to like master's degrees in actuarial science, and they were very happy to tell me about the profession because actuaries love to talk about ourselves because like no one really understands what we do and we like don't know how to explain it all that well. So like we like to talk, right? So I just ended up like deciding to take exams, had some early success, and networked my way into the profession.
That's awesome. Now, when you started in
Yeah.
the profession, though, you didn't start in insurance, right? If I
I
remember
started in
right.
consulting, and
Started
I
in consulting.
miss consulting in many ways, by the way.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. How do you, first of all, I think when we talk about career changers and the people that we've
Mm-hmm.
had in here that are career changers, it's usually like they switched practice areas, which you have done, and we'll talk about that more, or they have gone from being an actuary and then using those skills to something else. I don't think that I can say that we've ever had somebody on the podcast where they started as something else
Mm-hmm.
and then decided to be an actuary well after college and then
Mm-hmm.
became an actuary and then getting to what you were saying and then change practice areas as well. So I do think it would be interesting for people to hear your experience. How do you compare and contrast the different actuarial roles that you've had? So you mentioned you started in consulting.
Mm-hmm.
You're working in
Pension
insurance now.
consulting.
And how do you, when you think about just the day to day on those and what you liked, what you didn't like, how do you compare and contrast?
Yeah, there's a lot there to talk about too. So I went from pension consulting to life insurance. And on the one hand, both of those are long term. Like we both care about death, right? Like what long-term liabilities, we both care about death. We want to know when people die. Annuities is the same for the same reason. We care when people die because you stop payments. Or for life insurance, you care about people alive because you're going to pay at that point, right?
Hmm.
So conceptually, there's a lot there is that makes perfect sense together. Um, the day to day is very different, though. It's very different. Um, Consulting, and now it's been a number of years since I was in consulting. I think it was 4 years ago I made the switch. Um, Consulting, I feel like the game of the everyday is very, very clear about what you're doing. Like you're billing hours, you're working on your efficiency, you're keeping your clients happy. Like those basics are very, very clear. in insurance, I find it to be like not as clear.
Really,
There's a lot more
I'm
like,
very surprised by that.
really?
But yeah, I would have thought that insurance was a lot more regimented in terms of, you're going to do this and then this and then this, and it's just kind of a very cyclical process. But I mean, I say that I've never worked in insurance, so I don't have anything to,
That's
this is just
interesting.
my
And
preconceived notion. So,
I'm sure different insurance companies, yeah, I'm sure there's variance between the insurance companies, right? But my experience has been there's just so much more internal politics of what's going on, and different groups kind of putting their stakes in and priorities changing more quickly because of it,
do
which can
you,
lead to like confusion. Like it can lead to confusion, but it's just changing priorities. And then you don't end up doing things like in consulting, you end up doing the same thing over and over for different clients.
Mhm.
Um, Insurance, you'll do it like once, and then you have to remember it after doing it once, which is always fun.
um, do you find one of the things that I've wondered about, as I've talked to different people that are either exploring the profession um, or new to the profession, uh,
Hmm.
when I talk to them about the difference between like working internally at an insurance company versus working at a consulting firm, it's really just where your focus is on your stakeholders, right? In a consulting firm, your stakeholders tend to be external, right? That's how you get paid. And when you're in insurance, your stakeholders tend to be internal. Do you find
Internal.
that there's some of the same skill sets that you end up using today working at an insurance company that you used as a consulting actuary, but you're just now using it amongst the different groups that you're working with within your company?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So instead of client facing people skills, you learn how to manage your manager, for example.
Mhm.
Um, Instead of managing the relationship with your client, you're managing your relationship with your manager or your boss's boss even.
Yeah,
Those skills absolutely transfer. I mean, those
yeah,
are that level of like when we talk about EQ and people skills and whatnot that I think are like absolutely essential for consulting, because otherwise piss off clients and then you don't make any money, right? They're absolutely still useful in insurance, even though it's a kind of a different, I don't know, there's perhaps different like weightings
Mhm. But
to
what I think
those
is
skills.
interesting about what you said though is that those same emotional intelligence skills
Hmm.
that can make someone a very successful consulting actuary can also make someone a very successful insurance actuary, just in terms of uh, learning how to satisfy stakeholders internally, right? And I think it's an interesting observation, and it's good to hear somebody who's actually seen it play out in both
Hmm.
ways. And I like the way you put that. It's having that emotional intelligence skill is just as important for an insurance actuary as it is for a
It's just as
consulting actuary.
important. I think the big difference is with billable hours, it's somewhat easier to measure, and you have like a very tangible way of saying like you're doing this right or not. Or there's
Mhm.
just like bigger ways of measuring it. It's much harder to measure in insurance because we don't track our time the same
Yeah,
way.
yeah.
Even though I still mentally track my time.
There's some habits that
Some
don't die.
habits that do not change, like because I know the value of tracking my time without the kind of craze of
Yeah.
having to track my time as well.
That's funny.
Yep.
So you've obviously you've got a very different background than most professionally. You've
Hmm.
had the experiences in consulting, and insurance as an actuary. But if you weren't an actuary, what would you be doing
Oh
today?
my
And
God.
and and that
Yeah,
that's kind of a funny question to ask you, who came from not being an actuary to being an actuary.
I know. But you know that I have absolutely an answer to this. And it's a quick and easy one, even though it has, well, I don't know if it has nothing to do with actuarial science. It, of course it does, but not directly. You know what I would do is I would be planting trees.
Really?
Yeah, I'm very concerned about the climate crisis. And and there are more and more actuaries working in climate, in climate, what is it called? I'm losing the words.
Oh, yeah, and
Climate
like,
risk.
yeah, climate risk and sustainability and all of that.
Yeah. Um, if I really didn't have to pay the bills and whatnot, just
Just
I
go
I
plant
would be
trees.
planting trees.
That's a
I love trees. They're
that is a
beautiful.
that is a great aspiration, and I don't think
Yeah.
nobody is going to dissuade you from following that dream,
Yeah.
even in part, right?
Right.
Like you mentioned, if there was a way to do that and get paid, that would be even better.
Right.
But
Which probably means that I need to dabble in some actuarial risk, climate risk like work.
well, there you go. Then
You
there's
know.
definitely stuff going on that front. There's
Yep.
lots of work being done globally
Yep.
on that particular topic. So. Um, I mentioned early on in your introduction that you're a former board member of the Organization of Latino Actuaries. I want to talk about that for a few minutes here as well.
Yeah.
Um, so you were involved with the organization shortly after it was founded. Maybe you can give people an idea as to why OLA was created, and as an organization, what is OLA trying to accomplish?
Yeah. I was brought on the board. I was one of two of the first non-founding board members. And that was right at the beginning of 2020. So I wasn't part of the initial conversations that led to OLA's inception. And I've now rolled off the board, but I spent 4 years on the board. Um, so I have this I've seen some of the inner workings, seen some as more founding members have sort of done their time and decided to leave and handed things off. And it's just a very, very interesting time. Particularly because of everything that happened in 2020, right? Like I joined the board it was the end of 2019, joined the board January 1st, 2020, and then a pandemic hit, and then we have all this racial unrest, and then we have all these companies trying to figure out what to do about it,
Mhm.
what do we do in our own spheres about it, and I have all this previous nonprofit experience that has nothing to do with actuarial, so to speak, right? Nothing directly to do with actuarial, but I never thought that all of my previous nonprofit experience would be that relevant at that point of time. Um, anyways, I didn't directly answer your question. Can you repeat it?
Yeah, no problem. No, so and actually that's really good context, I think, for people to understand your
Mhm.
viewpoint on the organization. But um, maybe you can talk for a minute about why OLA was created in the first place. So you mentioned those founding members.
Absolutely.
Why did they come together? Why did they feel the need to create this organization? And to what end? Really, that's I think what people want to know.
Absolutely. There was a group of folks, of Latina folks, Latino. I'm going to use all the words: Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, Latine. What are some other ones? Latinidad, which is like Latinness.
Okay.
Okay. There was a group of folks who've found each other and were like, hey, where the heck are the rest of us? Like, how do we grow a community around this, and how do we help folks into the profession? And literally that's how it formed. Because if you look at the data, 2%, and the data, there's problems with data. I mean, we're actuaries, right? We know there's problems with data, but we're talking about low single digits representation of folks who identify in the large Latino Hispanic umbrella or in the profession, right?
Hmm.
2% is often quoted. Maybe it's a little higher when you look at new entrants. But again, the data is kind of weird. So we're maybe 2% of the profession, but we're 12. I think the more recent data shows that we're 12% of STEM graduates, and we're almost 20% of the population. So what is going on?
Yeah, there's clearly some disparities there from the population level down to filtering clear down to the actuarial profession.
Yeah, and that sort of disparity shows to me that there are barriers in place that are not in our control that we want to identify and eliminate, so
Mhm.
that this profession, which we want, or a lot of folks, I believe, want to be a meritocracy. We want it to be based on our abilities and want it to be based on our talents, right? Rather than just being in the right place at the right time or any number of these other privileges. So it exists, right? Why does all exist? Why did it start? It's because we want to push those numbers up and we want to break some of the barriers that exist that are not people's fault, but are part of the long and varied histories of the United States that have gotten in people's ways. And
Well,
in that way, I view it as making the profession a little more human, a little more um, in touch with all of our aspects of humanity.
no, I like the way you phrase that. That's because it would have been really easy to say, "Oh, just make it more diverse." But
Yeah,
but I think you hit on what that actually means,
yeah.
right?
I tend not to use. I think this is maybe a question that you have for later, but maybe we jump into it. Diversity, equity, inclusion. I really stray away from these words actually, because often I think that's not what we're talking about. I think that very often we use these words because we're trying to have an uncomfortable conversation that we don't know how to have.
Mhm.
And so we use them because we don't know how to talk. Like we don't know how to talk about these things. So like sometimes we say diversity, but we're really talking about racism. But we're
Mhm.
kind of scared to talk about racism because it's super scary.
You don't know how that conversation is going to go depending
you
on the person
know?
you're talking to. Yeah, fair enough.
And sometimes we're talking about our humanity. And so I'm just like, can we just use the words that we actually mean?
No, I think that's good, and I do think though you're onto something there because I think a lot of people do when they do talk about diversity within the profession, they are talking
Mm-hmm.
about the humanity element of it.
I mean, it's like business is a human endeavor. These, I think consulting actuaries understand this really well because you have to have good relationships with your clients, and that's a human to human contact. You have to understand, you have to be able to see yourself and you have to be able to see other people.
Hmm.
And these things get in the way of us seeing each other for who
Yeah,
we are and the full nuance of who we are, right?
yeah. No,
That's the humanity of it, and that's the benefit of it.
no, I love it. I think that is probably one of the more well articulated
Mm,
viewpoints on what it actually means to be striving for a diverse profession. So I really
mm,
appreciate that. Um, let's go back and talk Ola just a little bit more because you're in
yeah.
talking through some of these things and talking about why the organization was formed. I think as an organization, you actually have done some research to identify like why aren't we seeing more
Hmm.
Latinx people entering the profession? I think it would be interesting for people to know what some of those findings are.
Yeah. Um, have we done research, not rigorous research ourselves, but we've pulled on like the joint committees research and not to discount our own collective experiences, right? Our
Hmm.
discussions of our own collective experiences.
Some of it being anecdotal, then.
Some of it being anecdotal, of course, but when you start to see results as you address those anecdotal barriers, you're like, okay, this is just anecdotal. This is more of a trend, right?
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so early awareness of the profession. I mean, that one, it's so interesting because that one is like, that really doesn't, it affects, of course, it affects Latino folks more or just disproportionately more, but like how many people still don't know what an actuary is around the country? Like, so we're
Hmm.
such like a niche profession in that way. Like, just this morning, literally dropping my son off at daycare, someone was like, "What do you do?" I was like, "Yeah, I'm an actuary." And they're like, "Oh." I was like, "Oh, you know what that is?" And they're like, sort of.
I've heard the word. Yeah.
Right? Like, I'm like, that's better than most people. Um, so but early awareness is such a huge thing.
Hmm.
And and how do you break through early awareness. Uh, I mean, it's so difficult.
Yeah,
It's a difficult problem.
no, and I can appreciate that too. I've actually contemplated that a little bit about
Mm,
just my own kids and what they're exposed to.
hmm
And we live in an area in Colorado that's that is above average when it comes to affluency. And but
hmm
because of that, if you look at the people that we're around and their professions, they're very different than the professions if we went to another part of Colorado that wasn't as affluent. They're
Absolutely.
just going to be exposed to different things. It's nobody's fault, and there's nothing wrong with it either, but it's what you're around and what you experience,
And this is
right?
what we talk about when we talk about systems, right? It's like multiple layers of systems
Hmm.
that are influencing each other that is exposing you to different levels of stuff, right?
Yeah,
Or-
yeah. Yeah, like I even think about myself growing up,
Mhm,
and I grew up in a middle class family in the suburbs of Salt Lake City, and even then, the people what people were doing professionally, like I mean, I happened to stumble on the actuarial piece for it's a funny story, and we'll get into that another time, um, but like I think of what one particular profession that I think about was that there was not a lot of people that were like wealth managers or wealth advisors around me,
mm,
which um, but where we live today, there are a lot more. And my boys have been exposed to people that do that for work. So I've got to
mhm.
imagine then that when you're talking about this in context of people from Hispanic heritage, this is what we're talking about. They tend to not be around people that where actuary as a profession comes up all the time.
Yeah, yeah, and exactly. And I live in Milwaukee, which is the most segregated city in the country by race and by socioeconomic class. So when you talk about white neighborhoods, they're wealthy white neighborhoods. And when you talk about black neighborhoods, they're poor black neighborhoods. There isn't actually a distinct, there isn't like a middle class black neighborhood in Milwaukee.
Hmm.
It's a very specific context that we exist in.
Hmm.
So when you look at a high school outreach program, right? What high schools are we going to?
Hmm.
And usually the answer is the high schools you have that the actuaries who are in at your company have connections at, which were
Hmm.
their high schools, which
Yep.
happens then to be those suburban high schools, which then you can see it's like no one's fault, right?
Yeah.
It's no one's fault, but this is the system we're in that we're
Hmm.
trying to shift to open it up, right?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, and I like how you said that. Like it's naturally perpetuating, but not because
Mm-hmm.
anybody's being malicious. Um,
No,
it's just it's where they have connections. It's where they're comfortable, and so but there's consequences to that, and that's
but
I
there's
think what
consequences.
we're seeing to that. So
Mm-hmm.
talk to us a little bit about what Ola is trying to do to change that for students that are coming up through high school and maybe even into college to help them become aware and be successful in entering the actuarial profession.
Yeah, absolutely. And we only like touched on one of the barriers, right? So early awareness is one.
Hmm.
So late awareness is one of the barriers. Um, and there's also exam support. Having the time to do these exams, like how do you give someone time? That is
Hmm.
that is something that I'm thinking about a lot with my son. Like, how do I get more time?
If
Gosh.
you figure that one out, please let us know.
Right. I know, right? And if anyone listening has figured it out, please contact me and give me your tips, right? Um, but what is, gosh, what has Ola done? A lot of different high school outreach programs. We're done a bunch in the at the college level. So that is like talking about folks who already know what the profession is, but still need the support of a community like them to be able to
Hmm.
speak their language, so to speak. I'm
Hmm.
not even talking about like literally Spanish or
Right, right.
any other language, right? But like to be able to culturally translate, so to
Hmm.
speak. Um, there's a Rising Leaders program. I mean, what's cool about Ola in that in it being a younger organization is that we've been able to try things
Mhm.
and try them and see what works. Um, we we oh, I'm losing my words again. Guidance counselors. We
Mm.
in the more recent years we were able to get on some guidance counselor lists and found that hooked people into our scholarship program more easily because then the high
Interesting.
school kid knows what kind of scholarship they can get to help them get to college, to be able to pay for college, which will help them have more time to do
Hmm.
exams as they're working through how to piece all those things together,
No,
right?
that's interesting. I mean, we've seen it with the Conference of Consulting Actuaries specifically. We've seen some of the work that Ola has done the last few years. We've had Ola students attend the
Hmm.
CCA's annual meeting, and I know that Ola has done that with other actuarial
Right.
organizations as
Right. I didn't
well.
even get
And
to like the travel program and the
yeah, I
career
mean, there's a lot of
fair
things,
and
but
the like the scholarships and all that.
what I love what you're doing as an organization is actually getting not only providing the community support and helping them figure out like what resources they need to be able to be successful in entering the profession, but then actually bringing them on site to say, hey, come and meet a bunch of actuaries,
Right.
listen to what they're talking about, listen to how they're talking about it, network with them. I mean, for me, that's been some of the funnest
Oh my
experiences
gosh.
that I have had at the
Yeah.
CCA's annual meeting the last few years, is interacting with those students because they're so eager. They love
Hmm.
being there, and to watch them just soak it all in is extremely rewarding. And then a lot of them I have ended up connecting with on LinkedIn, and it's fun watching their career progression as they've gotten internship opportunities, they've gotten full-time actuarial jobs, and watching them be successful. It's fun to get that insight and that visual into the progress that Ola is making as an organization.
Absolutely. And if like I want to reiterate something you said because I agree. If you're at a conference and Ola is having a mixer, go because it's so fun. Like we have a good time. We know how to have a good time.
That's awesome. So I mean, I know you're off the board now, but I'm sure you're still connected in with the organization.
Mm.
What's coming next? What should people expect to see from the Organization of Latino Actuaries?
Yeah, I actually don't know how to answer this question succinctly. Like, I don't know actually. I mean, yeah, I'm sort of connected, um, but I'm also not,
I understand how that goes. Once I rolled off of the CCA's board, it was
you
the same
know?
thing. Like I see what's going on, but I don't know the inner workings. I don't know what's coming all the
I
time.
I'm not sure.
So let's reframe that then. And how
Sure.
can people get involved with OLA if they're interested in or something has piqued their curiosity based on what you've said? What's the best way for them to connect with the organization?
Yeah. I don't want to open up a whole other can of worms. I don't know if you're gonna have to edit this out, basically. Um, Besides like going on our website and contacting folks
Hmm.
to get like on our corporate sponsor list, that kind of thing, which I feel like is a very simple answer. That is always like the answer, right? Um, I don't know. I don't know.
I,
And I will say this though, that the energy that folks have towards what I said earlier of like making this profession more and more human. Don't only put it into nonprofits.
mhm.
Don't only put it into like support Ola, support Aeva, support Saga, support Sana, like support Abacus. Absolutely. But don't pretend either that that is the answer to all of our problems
Mhm.
because it's complex
Yeah, it's not
and
enough, right?
it's not enough. It's not enough because it wasn't meant to be enough. Like nonprofits themselves have issues with burnout and not having enough volunteers and not being scalable and all these and always chasing money
Mm-hmm.
in order to become more sustainable, and the volatility of that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I want folks to look at their sphere of influence and like deeply reflect on what they are doing in their sphere of influence. And yes, like, make that sphere of influence bigger by connecting into these national organizations. But but like, we're not the answer either. Like, we're
Mm-hmm.
not. We're another system at play trying to
Mm-hmm.
do something.
Yeah, I think it would be a mistake for people to think that just because they might be financially supporting any of those organizations that you listed, that they can check the box on
Check
everything
the box, right?
DE&I, right? It's not enough, and it does matter what we do in our day-to-day interactions, uh, professionally, outside of what we do, for work even, and being
Mm-hmm.
able to find those opportunities to help support in whatever that ends up looking like. And I think maybe one of the greatest assets that people have to contribute, and it's the one that you had referred to earlier, that we all have a scarcity on, is time, right? Being able
Mm-hmm.
to find the time. And I'll actually bring this up just because I have done this in the past. I have not recent, but with Ola specifically, like, there's opportunities to
Mm-hmm.
volunteer your time to help with review resumes, do mock interviews. It's some of those programs that I
Yeah.
really love about the organization. And because it's not about just the financial support, but you are actually helping coach somebody on, hey, here are the things that you need to think about to be able to get this job that you're looking for.
And that's something money can't buy, right? And
Hmm.
that's really valuable.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Um,
but we have a hard time often, like, being able to gather that the folks who have like 1 hour,
mhm.
we don't have like 20 hours a week, because what the
Yeah.
heck, right? But we have 1 hour this quarter that I can do that.
Yeah.
We,
Yeah.
that's It's hard. It's hard.
Yeah,
It's
no, it
challenging.
is. But it's something that, again, if somebody is wanting to assess like where they are at with their own personal efforts and their own
Mm-hmm.
philosophies on what they're trying to do to make the world a better place,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's planting trees or coaching somebody on something that otherwise they wouldn't know anything about. Like, that's all very important. And actually, that leads into the last few questions that I want to talk about with our time.
Yeah.
um, I have always said that understanding and applying the principles of DE&I is really a leadership skill, which is why we
Yeah.
talk about it actually on this podcast quite a bit. I think it's one of those leadership skills that there's a lot of buzzwords out there, like, as you,
Mm-hmm.
DE&I itself is a buzzword at this point, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but actually understanding like the implications and how to apply it, to me, is what's going to be a defining leadership skill for anybody in the profession or out,
Mm-hmm.
um, when it comes to leading. So I'd be very curious, and you've touched on this already as it relates to just the DE&I aspect of leadership, but
Mm-hmm.
there's the volunteering aspect of leadership as well,
Mm.
and the things that you learn. Like, and you've obviously had a lot of volunteering opportunities inside
Mm.
and outside of the profession. What have you learned from volunteering just in general?
Oh gosh, right? Where do you start? I think what I would want to emphasize with folks is the experience of volunteering often helps in building empathy. And empathy is such a skill.
Mhm.
And it's a hard one, because I think it's Brene Brown. I love Brene Brown.
I'm a fan
I'm
as
not
well.
I'm not going to be able to quote, if it's her, I'm not going to be able to quote verbatim, but I believe it's Brene Brown who talks about, like, in order to really empathize with someone else, like, you have to tap into something in yourself
Mhm.
that feels something similar. Even if you don't have that experience, right? Like,
Mhm.
a friend of mine recently lost a parent. I know that that is one of the most difficult things when you lose your parents. I've never lost my parents. I know enough to know that I don't know what that's like, but I also know enough to know that that's one of the hardest things for folks.
Mhm.
I think that volunteering and listening to folks can help you build empathy.
Mhm.
And the more and more empathy you can build, the more and more nuance you hold. And I think that gets at the heart of what DEI, whatever we want to call it. I think it gets to the heart of what people really actually want, which is to be seen and to be held in all the nuance that we are.
Mhm.
Not to be flattened into any stereotypes, not to be flattened into any assumptions. Like, we're actuaries, we talk about assumptions all the time. And we want, it's sometimes okay to make reasonable assumptions, but we have to be explicit about what assumptions we're making. And
Yeah.
often we are making assumptions about people that are neither reasonable nor conscious. And if we can make it conscious, then we can see how unreasonable it is. And then we can hold people with the more nuance of who they are.
I like that. Actually, I was doing some stuff for a preparation for a conference presentation and looking at some actuarial standards of practice and disclosures on
Mm.
assumptions. And when you were saying that, I was like, yeah, wouldn't it be awesome if we personally had to disclose the assumptions that we were making, where we could about somebody else, right? We'd at least come to terms with the fact that, hey, this is my assumption
We
and this is my
do it.
justification for it. Because we all do it. You're right. We do it
We do it.
unconsciously. I mean, there's a whole
Mm-hmm.
topic of unconscious bias that we could get into, but we don't have time for.
All
But
right.
but what an interesting concept though to say, and let's see if we can tie some of this stuff together, because
Sure.
I love what you said about what volunteering has provided you was that level of empathy that you probably wouldn't have gotten somewhere else, and I think you hit it on the head that
Mm.
underlying everything that we talked about with the E&I and how I would view it as a leadership skill, and I hope other people would view it as a leadership skill. The foundation of it is empathy and is being
Empathy,
able
right?
to understand those nuances, like you said, and then you branch out from there about, okay, what assumptions am I making? What's the rationale for them? It's not to say that making assumptions is bad. We do it as a profession, right? But you have to be cognizant about what assumptions you're making and why. And that's something that from a DE&I and an empathy skill, like that's I think a major step for people to explore is
Mm-hmm.
can I articulate the assumptions that I'm making about someone in a particular situation and what's at the root of that assumption? It's not a natural thing that we do for ourselves. It's absolutely something
No.
naturally we do with numbers and data and
Yeah,
models, but really to be a successful leader on a DE&I basis, it really does require you to have that self-awareness and have that self-reflection to obtain that self-awareness.
absolutely. And I think, I mean, I do think that it's undervalued. And I think that it's something as a profession we're kind of wrangling with, like, how do we build these skills? And maybe we do know how to do it, maybe we don't know how to do it.
What would you recommend to people? Somebody that's listening to this and says, you know what, I'm buying into what they're saying here. I know
Mm-hmm.
I need to be more self-aware, develop that empathy. Like, what would you tell somebody to do as a first step?
Yeah. I think the safest thing to do, because it can be really hard. It has to be internal work, in my opinion. Start somewhere internal. So just make a small shift where, for example, you're on social media anyway, start following some folks you don't usually follow. There's always someone who's been talking about this before you've arrived. And so find the people who are talking about it, who've been talking about it first, and just
Mhm.
listen. And just listen and just listen and just listen. Like, okay, this is a whole other can of worms. I'm going to touch on it though. In 2020, with George Floyd's murder, and with corporations being like, what do we do? With everyone being like, what do we do? One of the things that I was thinking about, and I continue to think about, is how do non-Black Latinos, white Latinos, mestizo Latinos, how how the heck do we show up in a moment like this that is very Black and very Black and white? And
Hmm.
why do we keep failing to show up? And so what I did was I said someone else, probably a Black woman, has been talking about this already, and I'm the only one who's new to this conversation. Not the only one, but I'm the one who's new to the conversation. How do I find them?
Hmm.
And I just started searching little things, right? And then I just started listening. And then I had a whole identity crisis because it like really challenged my notion of what Latinidad, which I alluded to earlier, like
Hmm.
Latinness. It challenged my concepts of my identity as Latin. And it was really healthy for me, and but really, really hard.
Oh, I bet. I
It's the
bet.
kind of thing where like it's as easy and as hard as changing your mind.
Hmm.
It's as easy and as hard as changing your mind.
Yeah.
So where do people start? Start anywhere. Start somewhere. Start by listening.
Hmm.
Find somewhere where you can start listening. Start consuming media that's a little different than you consume right now,
Hmm.
and just let it kind of sit for a while.
Well, and for hopefully for some people,
Hmm,
this could be their starting point. So, um,
maybe.
uh, no, but there's lots of good things here, and this has been a really insightful conversation. I really appreciate everything that you've shared, Jess. I think there's definitely been insights that I've gained here, and I know other people will benefit from hearing your perspective on this as well, because I think you talk about it in a way that is much more relatable than some of the platitudes of DE&I that we hear all the time,
It
and
doesn't even, yeah. And
I
I'm someone
really
who like
appreciate that.
believes in DEI or whatever that means, but I find it also to be just like, eh, come on now.
No, this is great, and I know our listeners will benefit from your perspective here. So
Mm.
I want to thank my guest today, Jess Vega. Jess, if people want to connect with you or with the Organization of Latino Actuaries, what's the best way for them to reach out?
Ola, our website is latinoactuaries.org. And as for me, you can find me on LinkedIn. Gosh, I don't remember my LinkedIn tag.
They can find
I
you.
think
They
it's
can
Jess
find you at
Vega.
Jess Vega. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's all right. No, that's
I
great. But
think it's
Jess,
Jess Vega.
thank you again. I appreciate appreciate your perspective. I've learned a lot. I know other people will get a lot out of this as well. The leadership development community of the CCA is open to any actuary. You can reach out to the CCA staff to join. I want to thank Shannon Peterson of the CCA staff for helping to organize today's event. You can join us for upcoming CCA events and follow us online on social media and on our website. Jess, again, thank you for being my guest and joining me for a part of your day, and really appreciate all of your contributions to the conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.